All right, so let's start with the big story that we are tracking on WION at this hour, where the Russian President Vladimir Putin held his first telephone conversation with the newly elected German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. The conversation has come amidst the rising tensions between Russia and Ukraine. Kremlin has said, and I quote, the hope was expressed that some serious negotiations will be organized on all issues raised by the Russian side. The Scholz's office also has released a statement that said that the Chancellor expressed his concerns about the situation and spoke of the urgent need for de-escalation. For several weeks now, Vladimir Putin has accused the United States and the NATO alliance of trying to stoke tensions near Moscow's borders. Now, Putin has warned that Russia is in fact prepared to resort to military action in response to the unfriendly behavior by the West. Now, this shows a sharp escalation in rhetoric since the middle of November. The United States has been sounding an alarm that Russia could potentially be planning a large-scale ground invasion into Ukraine. The Western governments have accused Moscow of positioning nearly about 100,000 troops near its border with Ukraine. Russia, for its part, has denied plotting any kind of a ground incursion into Ukraine.
Вооруженные конфликты, кровопролитие – это абсолютно не наш выбор. Мы не хотим такого развития событий. Мы хотим решать вопросы политико-дипломатическими средствами, но иметь хотя бы ясные, понятные, четко изложенные юридические гарантии. Вот в чем смысл наших предложений, изложенных на бумаге и направленных в Брюссель и Вашингтон. И мы надеемся получить на них ясный, исчерпывающий ответ.
Last week, Russia had presented a list of demands to the United States and NATO at a meeting with defense officials. Russia had also voiced some concerns over what it described as a US missile deployment in Poland and Romania. Despite hinting at the possibility of a conflict, Putin insists that Russia wants to avoid bloodshed.
Наши документы, проекты наших договоров и соглашений, которые были направлены руководству Соединенных Штатов и НАТО по вопросам обеспечения стратегической стабильности. Вот мы видим уже, что их некоторые наши недоброжелатели, прямо скажу, интерпретируют как ультиматум со стороны России. Это ультиматум или нет? Конечно, нет.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has voiced frustration over NATO's reluctance to speed up Kiev's membership to the NATO alliance.
Не можемо сьогодні прийняти тезу, яка також дуже популярна, про ЄС через 30 років, а НАТО колись там через років 50, десь там будемо. Це демотивує всіх і уповільнює. Ми повинні не чекати, доки хтось вирішить наші проблеми за нас, а саме шукати і пропонувати нові, щоденно нові механізми, нові формати.
Volodymyr Zelensky wants to get a very clear picture from NATO on the prospects of Ukraine's membership in 2022. Now, Kiev has also been seeking to join the US-led alliance for several years now. However, the Western officials have said on numerous occasions that this is something that is not on the cards at this point of time. All right, now to give us more insights in terms of what's in fact happening in Russia along the border with Ukraine, we are joined in by our correspondent Stuart Smith, who is joining us live from Moscow. Stuart, thank you very much indeed for joining us in this broadcast on WION. So this is the first telephone conversation that we are given to understand that has actually taken place between the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the new Chancellor in Germany, Olaf Scholz. What was in fact spoken between the two leaders?
Yeah, the first conversation, and also President Putin spoke with the French President Emmanuel Macron. Both countries very important in this context because both of them are countries that make part of the so-called Normandy format group of countries. That's France, Germany, Russia and Ukraine. And this was created to try and come up with a solution to the problem with the autonomous region which has set itself up in eastern Ukraine and which is at the centre of this dispute. This region is currently administered by an autonomous government but supported by Russian aid, and Ukraine would say supported by Russian troops, despite the fact Ukraine still believes it's part of its country. And that's exactly what President Putin and Olaf Scholz, the new German chancellor, spoke about, was whether there's a way to get this meeting going again. Over recent years, since 2019, there hasn't been a meeting which made any progress on this matter, and Olaf Scholz is clearly keen to get Germany and France back to the negotiating table with Ukraine and Russia. But Russia, in response to this request, again repeated by Germany, says that Ukraine needs to take a lot of action first to get to a point where discussions can resume. Russia, Moscow, the Kremlin says that Ukraine is not yet at the point where discussions can continue because it's consistently violating its side of the deal. And Ukraine, for its part, says Russia is violating its side of the Minsk agreement.
Absolutely, indeed. Now, what is interesting about this conversation between the German Chancellor, the newly elected German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and Vladimir Putin, the question that a lot of people would want to know is how much of a leverage can Germany actually have on Russia, on Vladimir Putin, in a bid to try and somehow see if there can be a de-escalation that can be effected along the border with Ukraine.
Yes, well, the most obvious one, and the one which is potentially in the minds of Chancellor Olaf Scholz, is that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline has not yet been accredited for use. This is a gas pipeline going from Russia directly to Germany through the Baltic Sea. And that pipeline is something that Russia is incredibly keen to get operating, but the United States and some NATO countries are not. Germany's caught up in the middle and could decide to not to allow it to start operating, or the regulator in Germany could decide it shouldn't start operating. Note, though, that the pipeline has been completed and technically is ready to go. Now, we know that the accreditation for this pipeline is expected to only take place now in the second half of 2022. That's something that's changed since Olaf Scholz became Chancellor. Originally, it could have been approved as early as, say, February or March this next year. And so that is a point of leverage that he could use. However, there is reluctance on the side of Germany to use that leverage because gas imports are something that are sorely needed in Europe. And we saw yesterday that gas, again, the gas price has reached an unprecedented $2,300. And that is meaning that there is a lot of pressure for this pipeline to be completed, even if Germany would like to use it as leverage.
Absolutely, indeed. My last question to you, Stuart, is about what Ukraine wants to do at this point of time. We've heard from Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, that he would like Ukraine to join the NATO alliance, but Russia says that that is a clear red line. With this being the stated position, do you see this conflict cooling off anytime in the near future?
Well, it's not just the position of Ukraine, it's the position of NATO, that only NATO allies and Ukraine should have a say about whether it joins. And NATO membership has been promised to Ukraine once it sorts out its own government first, with problems, for example, with corruption in the government, according to NATO. Once that's been cleared up, NATO says Ukraine has a route to membership, and only that discussion should happen within NATO and Ukraine. It says Russia has no veto on this, and so the security demands which it is making, it made on Friday and published on Friday, are not something that can be negotiated with. NATO says it's open for discussion, but that in particular, that idea that Ukraine should not be allowed to join NATO is something which is not up to Russia. And so where the countries go from here is as yet unknown. But Russia will have known this was a red line, and so therefore the question is, why did it demand such a thing? And analysts say that it could be because Russia sees no hope of these talks actually coming off, and then Russia would have an excuse to take escalating actions.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Stuart Smith, for joining us and getting us all those updates there. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.